11-year-old Maya Nelson stood frozen in first class, her boarding pass shaking in her tiny hand. The man in her seat refused to move. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Step aside, little girl. These seats aren't for you." The voice sliced through the air, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Heads turned. Some eyes widened in curiosity, others narrowed in quiet agreement. She had paid for that seat, seat 2A, but the man occupying it lounged back like royalty, smirking as though her very presence was a joke. Before she could even open her mouth, a flight attendant approached with the kind of smile that was sharper than a knife. "Sweetheart, maybe you're lost. This section is for premium passengers only." Humiliation. A child with every right to sit there, being erased in front of strangers. But here's the twist. Maya wasn't just any girl. Behind that trembling hand was the daughter of a billionaire, carrying her late mother's legacy like a weapon. And what happened next would turn this flight upside down. Now let me ask you, if you were that child, standing alone against a cabin full of doubters, would you fight for your place, or would you sit down and disappear? Before we continue the story, if you believe a voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard, show it by clicking like and subscribing for more, because what happens next is about more than just a seat. Hours earlier, before that explosive confrontation, Maya Nelson had stepped onto the plane with a weight in her hands heavier than any carry-on. In her small leather portfolio was a speech that didn't belong to any child her age. It was her mother's legacy. Her mother, a scientist whose brilliance was stolen by cancer 6 months ago. Maya had promised she would stand in Boston and speak those words at the award ceremony, no matter how hard it hurt. Her father wanted to protect her, to cancel the trip, but Maya insisted. She was only 11, yet her determination felt older than time itself. She walked through Chicago's O'Hare Airport with a locket bouncing against her chest, her eyes dry, but her heart heavy. Every step was a reminder. This wasn't just a trip. It was a mission. The moment she entered the first-class cabin, the air grew different. The seats gleamed, the glass partitions sparkled, and the attendants smiled, but not with warmth. Their smiles were the kind that said, "You're being tolerated, not welcomed." Passengers glanced up from newspapers, laptops, champagne flutes. Their eyes lingered longer than polite curiosity allowed. It wasn't the innocent curiosity people give a child. It was sharper, colder, asking the unspoken question, what is she doing here? Maya felt the knot in her stomach. She had felt it before, in restaurants where waiters skipped over her table, in stores where eyes followed her father's wallet more than his smile. But here, in the elite silence of first class, that knot became ice. She pressed the portfolio tighter to her chest. Her seat was waiting. Seat 2A, her small island in this sea of suspicion. She counted the rows, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. The locket brushed her fingers again. She whispered to herself, for Mom. But just before she reached her row, the storm began. A man sat where she was supposed to sit. He didn't glance at her boarding pass. He didn't move. He leaned back with the casual confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to him. And when she hesitated, he smirked. The irony burned. Maya wasn't just carrying a speech. She was carrying the memory of a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice in spaces where she wasn't meant to belong. And now, her daughter was walking into the same battlefield. The polished cabin turned into a courtroom. Every stare became a silent judge. And as Maya stood before seat 2A, the man lounging there raised his eyebrows, waiting for her to falter. She didn't yet know it, but this wasn't about a chair. This was about the right to exist with dignity in a space designed to push her out. The silence grew heavier. The moment stretched like glass about to shatter. And just as Maya opened her mouth to claim her place, the man leaned forward with a smug grin and whispered for words that made the entire cabin hold its breath. Maya reached her row with steady, careful steps, the portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield. Seat 2A, her mother's seat, the one her father had booked with care, was supposed to be hers. But when she stopped, her breath caught. The seat was already occupied. A white man in a sharp blazer lounged back, as if the space had always belonged to him. His arms stretched casually across the armrest, his leg crossed with entitlement, his eyes glued to the glossy magazine in his hands. He didn't even glance up when Maya stood there, small and silent, boarding pass trembling slightly in her grip. Passengers nearby turned their heads. Some leaned just enough to catch the tension without being seen. The silence was thick, broken only by the hiss of overhead bins and muffled greetings from further down the aisle. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice careful but clear. "Excuse me, I think that's my seat." The man's eyes flicked up, slow and deliberate. His lips curved into something between a smirk and a dismissal. "Little girl," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, "these seats aren't for you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman across the aisle clutched her handbag tighter, while another man lowered his phone, listening. No one spoke. Maya held up her boarding pass, the ink bold against the paper. "It says to," she whispered. He leaned back further, folding his magazine, his smirk widening. "Maybe you're lost. Coach is back there." His hand gestured lazily toward the curtain dividing the cabin. "Someone like you belongs there." Her chest tightened. His tone wasn't just condescending. It was dismissive, absolute, as if her presence itself was a mistake. She wasn't seen as a paying passenger or even a child. She was something else, something unwelcome. The whispers grew. Some passengers stared openly now. Others hid their curiosity behind lowered lids. Every eye in first class weighed on her, waiting to see if she would shrink or stand. Maya tightened her grip on the portfolio. The silence around her was louder than any insult. And then, just as her lips parted to respond, a flight attendant started approaching. But whose side would she take? Her hand shook, but she refused to lower it. Maya lifted the boarding pass into the light, the numbers bold and undeniable. To A. For a moment, it was just paper between them, fragile proof that she belonged. The man's eyes flicked over it, slow and mocking, before he leaned back in the seat that was hers. His smirk deepened. "Sweetheart," he drawled, "that ticket doesn't mean much when you're sitting in the wrong section." The wrong section? His voice carried a casual cruelty that made nearby passengers lean closer. No one intervened. Some sipped their drinks, pretending not to watch, but their eyes betrayed them. Maya felt every stare like a stone pressing against her chest. She tried again, her voice steadier this time. "This says 2A. That's my seat." His laugh was soft, almost bored, but sharp enough to slice through her composure. "Little girl, maybe Coach is back there. Someone like you belongs there." The words landed heavier than the seat itself. He wasn't just denying her boarding pass. He was denying her presence, her right to exist in that space with dignity. The insult was bigger than the seat. It was the story behind his tone, the history in those words. Maya felt her throat tighten. She thought of her mother, standing in boardrooms full of doubters, never letting her brilliance be dimmed. She thought of her father, telling her that dignity is not given, it's carried. She pressed the locket against her chest with one hand, the boarding pass still in the other. To the man, she was not a grieving child on her way to honor her mother. She wasn't even a paying passenger. She was a mistake, an intruder. The silence around them was suffocating. Someone coughed. A camera phone lifted quietly in the back. Whispers spread like smoke. The cabin had turned into a stage, and Maya stood at the center, every move scrutinized. She wanted to cry. She wanted to vanish. But more than that, she wanted to hold her ground. Her small shoulders squared, her lips parted, and in a voice that carried more strength than she knew she had, she said, "I belong here." For a heartbeat, the words seemed to hang in the air, defying his smirk. And then, his face hardened. He leaned in, close enough for only her to hear, his whisper venomous. "Not in this lifetime." The audience of first class was no longer pretending. Phones tilted, eyes narrowed. A storm was brewing in silence. And just as Maya braced herself to speak again, a shadow fell across her. A uniformed flight attendant had arrived. But would she defend truth or enforce prejudice? The sharp click of polished shoes broke the silence. A flight attendant appeared beside Maya, her uniform immaculate, her smile stretched thin. For a moment, the tension in the cabin eased. Surely an authority, would bring order. Maya turned to her, relief flickering in her eyes. She lifted the boarding pass again, her hand trembling but steady. "This is my seat," she whispered. 2A. The attendant's eyes flicked from the paper to the man reclining in the chair. He didn't look nervous. In fact, his smirk deepened, as though he already knew what was coming. Passengers leaned closer, some openly now, their drinks forgotten. The cabin felt like a theater where everyone waited for the next line. The attendant crouched slightly, her voice soft and syrupy, but sharp underneath. "Sweetheart," she said, "let's not cause a scene. Why don't you step aside while we sort this out?" Maya froze. Step aside? She had the ticket in her hand. The proof. The right. But somehow, in that moment, the paper no longer mattered. Authority had already decided. The man shifted in the seat, his grin widening. "See? Just a little confusion," he said smoothly, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "She doesn't belong here." The words hit harder because they were backed by silence. The attendant didn't correct him. She didn't insist on fairness. Her smile never faltered, but her gaze carried a verdict. Maya was the problem. The cabin grew heavier, as if the very air had taken sides. Passengers whispered, some shaking their heads, others just watching with quiet acceptance. First class had become a courtroom, and Maya was losing before she could even speak. She clutched the portfolio tighter, the locket pressing cold against her chest. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. Dignity is not negotiable. But at 11 years old, dignity felt like sand slipping through her fingers. And then the attendant straightened, her eyes cutting toward the back of the cabin. She was reaching for her radio. Who was she about to call? And what power would they bring into this battle? The radio crackled, slicing through the tension in the cabin. The attendant's voice, calm but loaded, requested a supervisor. Heads turned, whispers thickened, and suddenly every sip of champagne, every turn of a page, every tap of a laptop keyboard came to a stop. The cabin was no longer a place of quiet luxury. It had become an arena. The man in seat 2A leaned back, smug as ever, his arms folded as though victory was already his. He didn't need to argue anymore. Authority was on his side now. Maya stood frozen, the portfolio pressed against her chest. She could feel the corners digging into her ribs, heavy with the words she was supposed to deliver in Boston. Words her mother would never get to speak. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it. She couldn't let them see her break. When the supervisor arrived, the weight of her uniform seemed even heavier than the polished wings pinned to it. She didn't bother to kneel down or smile. She looked at Maya like a problem to be solved, not a passenger to be helped. "What seems to be the issue here?" Her voice was clipped, professional, but cold. The man didn't miss a beat. "She's confused," he said smoothly. "Wrong section, wrong seat." I tried to explain, but she wouldn't move. Maya lifted the boarding pass with trembling hands. "This is my seat," she whispered, though her voice carried enough for the nearest rows to hear. The supervisor glanced at the ticket, but her expression never softened. "Miss," she said firmly, "we need to resolve this quickly. If you can't cooperate, we'll have to remove you from the aircraft." Remove you. 2 words that burned like fire. The cabin gasped softly, some passengers exchanging stunned looks, others simply watching with that familiar, icy curiosity. 11 years old, holding the proof in her hand, and yet she was the one threatened with removal. Maya's chest tightened. She reached for the locket at her neck, her thumb brushing over the tiny, silver frame. Her mother's face smiled up at her from inside, silent but strong. She could almost hear her voice. "Dignity isn't given, Maya. You carry it." Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Instead, she pressed the portfolio tighter, knowing what it represented. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about her right to speak, her right to be seen. And right now, they were about to silence her before she could even open her mouth. The supervisor straightened, already motioning toward the cabin door. "Final warning," she said coldly. "Step aside, where you will be escorted off this flight. And in that suspended second, as the entire cabin held its breath, Maya slowly opened her mouth. But what came out next would not be the voice of a child. The cabin was still buzzing from the supervisor's threat. Words like removal and escort hung in the air like smoke after a fire. To the watching passengers, it looked like the end of the line for the little girl who dared to stand her ground. 11 years old, alone, already being treated as if she were a criminal. Everyone waited for the obvious ending. They expected tears, a breakdown, defeat. But Maya didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't even move aside. Instead, she reached down into her small leather bag and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. With slow, deliberate movements, she unlocked the screen and pressed a single name. One name. The entire first-class cabin leaned closer, curious, confused. When her father's voice answered, Maya lifted her chin, her voice steady and calm. "Daddy," she said softly, but firmly enough that nearby passengers heard every syllable. "They're trying to take my seat." A ripple went through the rows. For the first time, the silence wasn't just about her. It was about the weight behind the word daddy. The supervisor stiffened, suddenly alert, as though realizing this moment might not end with a simple removal after all. The passenger in 2A smirked, dismissing the call with a shake of his head, whispering to no one in particular, "What's she gonna do? Call her babysitter?" But Maya didn't flinch. She pressed the phone closer. Her eyes locked on the man in her seat, her expression calm but sharp. She didn't need to raise her voice. The stillness of her composure was louder than any shout. Passengers exchanged glances. Some started recording discreetly, capturing the sight of a child staring down an adult world that wanted to erase her. Maya continued speaking into the phone, her words clear, precise. "Yes, I showed my ticket. Yes, it says 2A. They told me I don't belong here. They said they'll remove me." Her voice didn't break, not once. And in that moment, the luxury cabin, rows of leather seats, polished glass partitions, golden logos stitched into headrests, suddenly looked smaller, more fragile, because a little girl had turned it into a witness stand, and her quiet defiance was now testimony. What none of them realized was that this wasn't just a call between a daughter and her father. It was a signal to a man whose name carried more power than every employee on that plane combined. The white passenger in 2A leaned back, rolling his eyes, but his smirk faltered for the first time. The flight crew shifted uncomfortably. The mood had changed. The passengers who thought they were watching the humiliation of a child were now watching something else entirely. The beginning of a reckoning. Maya's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried across the aisle like a warning bell. "Daddy, they think I don't belong here." The cabin wasn't just watching anymore, it was waiting. Phones shifted in hands, whispers began to stir, and the air felt heavy with the sense that something bigger was about to break. Maya's quiet defiance had pulled the room to the edge of a moment that couldn't be undone. And as the first screen lit up, recording her every move, the question wasn't whether she'd be silenced. It was whether the world was about to hear her. The first-class cabin had been buzzing with the usual low hum of pre-flight routine. Seatbelts clicking, overhead bins shutting, whispered exchanges of stock tips and vacation plans. But after the confrontation in Seat 2A dragged on longer than anyone expected, the air shifted. The silence wasn't polite anymore. It was electric, charged with tension. People who had once pretended not to notice were now staring outright, their gazes fixed on the small black girl who refused to back down. At first, it was just one passenger in the second row, a young woman clutching her phone with trembling fingers. She angled it carefully, pretending to check messages while her camera recorded. Then another joined, a businessman across the aisle, phone tilted just enough to capture both Maya and the man who claimed her seat. The domino effect spread, one light after another glowing like fireflies in the dim cabin. Maya's humiliation was no longer just hers. It was being documented, witnessed, preserved, and that changed everything. Passengers whispered. A couple in matching navy blazers shook their heads, muttering just loud enough for others to hear. "She has the ticket. Why are they still questioning her? The man beside them leaned forward, his voice sharp with disbelief. Because she's a kid. Because she's black. That's the only reason. The words weren't shouted, but they spread like wildfire. Suddenly, what had been private embarrassment became a public trial. Every stare was a jury. Every camera was a gavel. And Maya, though only 11, stood at the center of it all like an unwilling plaintiff in a case against cruelty. The flight attendants, who had expected the cabin to stay silent, now felt the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on them. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, smoothing her skirt again and again, as though neat fabric could cover the ugliness unfolding. The older supervisor, stiff as a blade, glanced at the glowing phones with dread. She knew what those little lights meant. Control was slipping. This was no longer an internal matter. This was going to leave the cabin. Maya felt it too. For the first time, she wasn't just a girl fighting for her seat. She was a symbol. She could feel her mother's locket grow heavier against her chest, as if reminding her, dignity isn't given. It's claimed. And now the world was watching to see if she would claim it. But what shook the cabin even more wasn't Maya's defiance. It was the sound of her voice. Clear, steady, cutting through the tension, she said, "This is my seat. And you all can see that." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The truth has a way of traveling farther than volume. People leaned in. Heads turned. Someone near the back murmured, "Good for her." Another whispered, "She's braver than most adults I know." That was when the whisper turned into something louder. The businessman recording lowered his phone just long enough to say, "If they take her off this plane, it's going viral." The supervisor froze. The smug man in Maya's seat shifted uncomfortably, his entitlement cracking under the pressure of an audience he hadn't counted on. He looked around, waiting for someone to back him up, but the only thing he saw were narrowed eyes, glowing screens, and passengers ready to turn his arrogance into a headline. The power in the cabin had tilted. It was no longer about whether Maya belonged in seat 2A. It was about whether the airline, the crew, and the man in her chair could survive the consequences of trying to erase her. For the first time, Maya wasn't the one on trial. They were. And just as the supervisor opened her mouth to speak, a ripple of recognition passed through the front row. Someone gasped softly, their phone lowering as they whispered, "Wait, do you know who her father is?" At first, it was just a whisper, a stray word from one crew member to another, almost lost under the buzz of passengers murmuring. But on airplanes, whispers carry. They travel down the aisle faster than any announcement. And this one carried a name. Nelson. The sound of it made one attendant freeze, her practiced smile stiffening like glass. Another leaned in, asking quietly, "Did you just say Nelson?" Her eyes darted to the little girl standing in defiance, phone in hand, silver locket catching the cabin light. Passengers began catching fragments. Her father. Wait, Nelson is in. The white passenger, still sprawled arrogantly in seat 2, suddenly looked less amused. For the first time, his smug grin faltered. He wasn't sure why, but the tide was shifting, and it was shifting against him. Maya stood small, almost fragile, in the middle of all that leather and steel, but her presence was growing heavier by the second. Not because of her size, not because of her voice, but because of who she represented. One attendant finally said it out loud, her voice trembling, too loud for the discretion her uniform demanded. Her father is Adrian Nelson. The name cracked across the cabin like turbulence. Heads turned, mouths parted. People who had been silent witnesses moments before now shifted in their seats. Some passengers even gasped, recognizing instantly what that name meant. Adrian Nelson wasn't just another father. He wasn't just a grieving widower sending his daughter to honor her mother's legacy. He was the tech visionary who had built billion-dollar systems airlines themselves depended on. A man who had reshaped digital networks, invested in global infrastructure, and whispered into boardrooms that decided the fate of entire industries. And now, his daughter was the one standing accused of not belonging in first class. The irony was so sharp it hurt. The very system her father helped design was the same system threatening to erase his daughter's dignity. Passengers who hadn't cared before began leaning closer, their eyes wide. Phones tilted at new angles. People wanted to catch the moment when arrogance collided with power. Because everyone knew, when names like Nelson entered the room, consequences followed. The man in seat 2A coughed, trying to reclaim control. But control was slipping. The authority that once sat in his posture was dissolving as recognition spread like a fire he couldn't stamp out. He muttered, "That doesn't change anything," but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. For Maya, nothing outwardly changed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, clutching her portfolio tighter. Her calm silence carried a weight the cabin could no longer ignore. The flight attendants who had dismissed her earlier were suddenly pale, their professional tone cracking as they stumbled over words like misunderstanding and protocol. But it was too late. The spell of authority they had relied on was broken. This wasn't just a child anymore. This was Adrian Nelson's child, and no one wanted to be the name in tomorrow's headlines tied to humiliating her. The cabin air felt different now, tense, electric. It was no longer about whether Maya belonged in first class. It was about whether the entire airline would survive the fallout of what had just been exposed. But here's the question that hung in every passenger's mind, pulsing louder than the engines outside. If the whispers of her father's power had already shaken the crew this much, what would happen once Adrian Nelson himself stepped into the fight? In the polished silence of first class, the cabin crew thought they were only dealing with a stubborn child. But by the time Maya's father's name began circling the rows like static electricity, the walls of that aircraft could no longer contain the storm. What started as a quiet humiliation in seat 2, it was already seeping into places far above the clouds. The supervisor tried to hold her ground, pressing her lips into a corporate smile. She whispered words like operational necessity and protocol, but her hands trembled when she typed notes into the tablet she carried. Within minutes, a discreet message was transmitted from the cabin straight to the airline's control center on ground. In sterile offices lined with glowing monitors, the report landed. Minor disturbance in first class. Passenger in seat 2A claims another passenger's seat. Child involved. Boarding pass mismatch suspected. The word child should have ended it there. A minor inconvenience. An issue smoothed over before takeoff. But one line buried in the report made every manager who read it stop cold. Passenger identified as Maya Nelson, daughter of Adrian Nelson. Phones began ringing. Screens lit up. The chain of command, normally slow and deliberate, snapped awake with urgency. Because in the world of aviation, names mattered more than faces. And this was a name that could crash reputations faster than any storm. Adrian Nelson was not just a wealthy man. He was a man whose innovations sat inside the very systems these airlines depended on. His technologies controlled logistics, monitored security networks, processed millions of tickets every day. He wasn't just a customer. He was infrastructure. And now his daughter was being recorded on cell phones across first class, treated as if she were nothing, as if her seat was a privilege instead of her right. Executives scrambled to contain it. Emails flooded across time zones with subject lines in bold, urgent, priority, confidential. Calls buzzed in the ears of managers who had been ready to sign off for the weekend. Nobody wanted this on their desk, but now it was burning through every office floor like fire through paper. The irony was bitter. An airline built on precision, hierarchy, and discretion was unraveling because its frontline staff could not recognize dignity when it stood in front of them. Inside the plane, passengers continued to whisper, their phones raised like lanterns. Each recording was a fuse waiting to ignite. On the ground, a legal team debated language. Should they call it a misunderstanding? Should they invoke random checks? Every word felt dangerous, every phrase a potential headline. For Maya, the cabin still felt like a battlefield. For the company, it was beginning to feel like a courtroom with no defense. The footage would not stay hidden. The narrative would not stay controlled. It was already escaping their grip. The supervisor, sensing the weight pressing down from above, bent lower to whisper in her colleague's ear, "Headquarters is watching." Her voice cracked on the last word. She understood what that meant. This was no longer about following procedure. This was about survival. Hers, the airline's, perhaps even the man in seat 2A who had thought he was untouchable. In boardrooms miles away, executives leaned back in leather chairs, realizing a humiliating truth. A little black girl had become their biggest liability. A single stolen seat was threatening to ground an entire reputation. And the longer the plane sat unmoved, the heavier the panic grew. But here's the question no one in those offices could answer, the one that hung between the passengers, the crew, and the executives glued to their screens. If Adrian Nelson himself picked up the phone, would this be just an internal crisis, or the beginning of a global scandal that no airline could escape? For nearly an hour, the cabin of first class had been a theater of humiliation. Maya Nelson had stood there, her boarding pass shaking in her small hand, while authority bent itself into knots to erase her presence. But now something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a single act. It was the air itself. The same cabin that once pressed down on her with silence was now leaning toward her. The current had changed. The supervisor, who only moments earlier had threatened her with removal, now found her voice breaking on words of apology. She used the language of corporate survival, not compassion. We may have misunderstood, perhaps a miscommunication, but her tone betrayed her panic. The neat script of operational necessity no longer worked, not with half the cabin recording. Passengers had become witnesses, and witnesses had become amplifiers. Their whispers were louder than any intercom. They had seen the cruelty unfold. Now they were measuring the airline's every word, ready to judge again if dignity was denied. And there, in the center of it all, was Maya. She hadn't grown taller. She hadn't raised her voice. Yet somehow, she had become the gravitational pull of the room. The man in her seat no longer smirked. He shifted, restless, his entitlement unraveling under the weight of eyes no longer on his side. One by one, the flight attendants changed their posture. Their clipped politeness softened into cautious respect. The supervisor who once dismissed her now leaned forward, lowering her voice as though speaking to someone powerful. "Miss Nelson, we'd like to resolve this immediately." "Miss Nelson." The words fell awkwardly, as if dragged out of a throat that didn't want to admit them. Just minutes earlier, she was a little girl. Now, she was being addressed with titles usually reserved for adults. That change said more than any apology ever could. Maya didn't need to shout or demand. She simply held her portfolio close, the locket gleaming faintly under the cabin lights. The silence of her composure was louder than the excuses around her. She wasn't the one scrambling. They were. On the ground, managers barked orders into headsets. Screens flashed updates. The chain of command was frantic, but up in the air, the truth was undeniable. The smallest passenger in first class now commanded the entire space. The irony cut deep. A child who had been treated as an intruder was suddenly dictating the behavior of grown adults in uniforms, of executives in distant boardrooms, of a man who had thought a luxury seat was his birthright. The shift was not polite. It was seismic. Passengers leaned closer, whispering to one another. "She's just a kid." "No, she's more than that." They weren't sure how to describe it, but they felt it. The invisible current had reversed. Prejudice had turned into exposure, arrogance into shame. The supervisor tried again, voice trembling. "We'd like to offer you accommodations, upgrades, anything you need for your comfort." Her words dangled in the air like currency, but everyone knew they were too late. What Maya had lost wasn't comfort, it was dignity, and dignity couldn't be refunded. Still, the apology poured in. "We regret the misunderstanding. This isn't our standard of service." Polished phrases polished over fear. The airline wasn't protecting her. It was protecting itself. And yet, in trying to salvage its reputation, it had inadvertently crowned her the most powerful person in the room. For the first time since boarding, Maya sat down in seat 2A. The man who had refused to move now looked as if the chair was burning beneath him. He glanced at the glowing phones around him, realizing too late that his arrogance was being documented forever. And as Maya fastened her seatbelt, calm and deliberate, the thought hit every person in that cabin like turbulence. This girl hadn't just won back her seat. She had turned the balance of power upside down. But even as the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, a question lingered in the air like static before a storm. If this was what she could do on a single plane, what would happen when her father's voice entered the fight? The cabin had quieted, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush of a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Everyone's eyes were on Maya, a little black girl in a seat she had fought to claim, but her presence carried more weight than any boarding pass ever could. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply held her phone against her ear, her father's voice steady on the other end. And with that call, the story shifted. Her father didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't rage. He spoke with the patience of someone who had built empires, someone who had been dismissed 1,000 times before only to prove every doubter wrong. His calm voice floated through the line. Maya, stay seated. Do not move. This is not about a chair anymore. This is about dignity. Passengers leaned closer, pretending not to eavesdrop, but hanging on every syllable. The airline crew, who had once treated her like a child out of place, now shuffled nervously, suddenly aware that this wasn't a private inconvenience. This was evidence. Every word spoken, every action taken was being weighed. Maya pressed the locket at her chest, and when she spoke, her words landed with a clarity far beyond her 11 years. I have my ticket, I have my seat, and I have my right to be here. But you all try to take it away from me. Not because of rules, not because of operational necessity, but because you looked at me and decided I didn't belong. The cabin rippled with discomfort. She had stripped away the polite excuses and pointed straight at the truth. The man who had stolen her seat shifted uneasily, his earlier smirk gone. He avoided the cameras now, hiding behind the thin wall of silence. The attendants tried to keep their faces composed, but their hands betrayed them, clutching clipboards too tightly, smoothing skirts that didn't need smoothing. The supervisor, who had invoked procedure only minutes earlier, now stood rigid, her power dissolving under the heat of so many watching eyes. Maya's father didn't need to be in the cabin to make his presence felt. His voice through that phone was enough. Calm, firm, undeniable. This is not just about my daughter. This is about every black passenger who has been told, with a smile, that they were in the wrong place. About every child who has been silenced before they could speak. Today, you made her stand trial for her own existence. Those words turned the air electric. This was no longer a quarrel over a seat. It was a mirror held up to an entire system. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they weren't just witnesses. They were jurors in a case that stretched beyond this plane, beyond this flight, into something older and uglier. The corporate language, discretion, random, experience, sounded hollow now. Everyone could see it. Those words weren't neutral. They were shields used to hide cruelty. And here was Maya, 11 years old, dismantling them with the truth of her presence. She had every right to that seat, yet she had been treated as an intruder. That wasn't an accident. That was a pattern. A businessman near the aisle shook his head slowly and whispered, "This isn't about rules. This is about race." Another passenger muttered, "She's braver than all of us." And just like that, the silent majority that had once looked away began to murmur in agreement. The tide wasn't just turning, it was roaring. The irony burned. The people who had tried to silence her had handed her the loudest microphone in the room. What began as humiliation was now testimony. Maya adjusted in her seat, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. My mother spent her life fighting to be heard in rooms where she was treated as invisible. She's gone now, but I am here, and I will not disappear just because it makes people comfortable. A silence fell so deep it was almost sacred. And then, her father's voice, sharp and final through the phone. This airline will answer for what it did today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. The supervisor froze. The man in two, swallowed hard. And the passengers, every single one of them, knew something bigger was about to happen. Because this was no longer about Maya defending her seat. It It was about a billionaire drawing a line in the sand. And the question that hung in the cabin like thunder was simple. Would the airline bend or break? The supervisor still stood near the front of the cabin, clipboard tucked tight against her chest like a shield. Her posture screamed control, but her eyes betrayed something else: unease. She had heard enough from the passengers, enough from the smug man in 2A, and enough from the little girl who refused to bend. But what froze her spine wasn't Maya. It was the ripple of consequences that were already moving far beyond her control. Because the moment Maya's call ended, another one had already been placed. Not to a gate agent, not to the crew, but straight to the airline's corporate leadership. Mr. Nelson wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the kind of weight that no apology script could neutralize. Calm, deliberate, unshakable. He spoke as though the future of the airline was already in his hands. "Your crew," he began, "has humiliated an 11-year-old child who was seated exactly where her ticket placed her. My daughter, you need to understand that this isn't about a mistake. This is about a culture of dismissal that made a grown man feel entitled to steal her seat and made your staff feel empowered to support him. That is a systemic failure, and I will not let it stand." The executive on the other end tried to offer corporate phrases: misunderstanding, standard procedure, operational necessity. Mr. Nelson cut through them like glass. "No, don't tell me about procedure. Tell me why a black child in first class is treated like a fraud until proven otherwise. Tell me why your version of discretion always seems to land on the side of erasing us." Silence. The kind of silence that told everyone listening that there was no safe defense. Then the demands came. Crisp, unmistakable, non-negotiable. 1. This crew will be relieved from duty immediately upon landing. They will undergo mandatory cultural retraining. Not optional. Documented. Public. 2. A formal, written apology will be issued to my daughter, signed by your CEO, and it will acknowledge what this was: prejudice, not error. 3. You will release a statement committing to systemic change, not just to protect Maya, but every child who will walk into one of your cabins after her. And if you hesitate, if you bury this behind your legal department, I will make sure the world knows that your company chose humiliation over humanity. I have the platform. I have the reach. And I will not blink. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like iron on the ears of the executive. Maya sat in silence, her small hands folded over the portfolio on her lap. For once, the burden wasn't on her to prove anything. Her father's voice, steady, relentless, carried the fight for her in places she couldn't reach. The little girl they tried to erase had become the symbol that could expose an entire system. The cabin itself didn't know the details of what was happening miles above their heads in corporate headquarters, but they could feel the shift. The supervisor's stiffness, the way her eyes flickered toward the glowing phones, the way she suddenly stopped issuing commands. It wasn't authority anymore. It was hesitation, fear. Something had changed, and though no one could name it yet, the atmosphere told the truth. Power was no longer in this cabin. It was now in a boardroom, where the fate of this flight and this airline was being decided in real time. And Maya, 11 years old, sat quietly at the center of it all, unaware that her father's voice was already shaking the walls of corporate America. The man in seat 2 had started the flight with a smirk. That smirk was gone now. His arms, once spread wide as if he owned the row, pulled tight across his chest. The confidence had drained from his face as whispers moved through the cabin. What began as quiet chuckles at his arrogance now sounded like verdicts being read out loud. The jury was no longer silent. The jury was every passenger with a phone, every stranger online who had already seen Maya's humiliation in shaky video clips. He knew it, and so did the crew. The mask of authority on the flight attendants began to crack too. The younger one avoided Maya's gaze, her smile stiff, her hands trembling as she smoothed her uniform again and again. The supervisor, once so sharp and commanding, seemed smaller now. She kept glancing at the galley phone, waiting for orders that weren't coming fast enough. Corporate leadership had already been alerted. Their silence wasn't protection, it was judgment. The unraveling began with words no one expected to hear inside that polished first-class cabin. A soft but firm voice came from the intercom. "We would like to apologize to our passengers for the delay. Certain matters are under review. Please remain seated." Under review. The coded phrase hit the crew like a verdict. It meant corporate had seen enough. It meant someone was about to pay. Passengers exchanged looks. A woman in row 3 whispered, "They're done for." Another nodded, her phone still recording, adding quietly, "Every second of this is already out there." The weight of public opinion was no longer abstract. It was a hammer hanging above the guilty. The man in Maya's seat tried to salvage dignity. He muttered something about misunderstanding and policy confusion, but no one bought it. The videos showed everything. His words, his smirk, his dismissal of a child holding a valid boarding pass. He had turned dignity into a spectacle, and now his downfall was the spectacle. The supervisor approached him, voice hushed but clipped, instructing him to move. Not out of sympathy for Maya, but because her own authority was slipping away. He rose reluctantly, eyes darting at the glowing phones, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he looked small. Smaller than the little girl he tried to erase. As he shuffled down the aisle toward another seat, murmurs followed him like shadows. No one offered him comfort. No one looked away. The humiliation he tried to impose had turned back on him, multiplied. And the crew? The whispers of suspension and disciplinary review swirled through the cabin. Every passenger could see it. The very people who tried to silence a grieving child were now waiting for the silence of their own careers. The irony was complete. The people who treated Maya as invisible were the ones fading into invisibility. But just when the cabin thought the storm had passed, the supervisor's radio crackled. A coded message from headquarters, short, sharp, urgent. Her face went pale. Whatever she heard wasn't just about discipline. It was something bigger. And when she turned her eyes back toward Maya, there was no smugness left. Only fear, because this wasn't over. The fight for seat 2A should have ended inside the cabin, but the truth was already airborne. By the time the plane's wheels left the runway, the story was racing faster than the jet itself. Passengers had uploaded clips of Maya standing tall against a man twice her size, of a crew more loyal to prejudice than to policy. The world was watching before the flight even touched Boston. It began with a trickle, a single post on Twitter with shaky footage and a caption. "This little black girl is being denied her seat in first class." Within minutes, retweets multiplied, comments piled on, and hashtags formed like storm clouds. Hashtag seat 2A. Hashtag flying while black. Hashtag justice for Maya. Screens lit up across the cabin. Some passengers gasped as they saw their own faces reflected in trending posts, frozen mid-whisper, mid-stare. Others leaned back in their seats, realizing their silence was no longer invisible. The cabin had turned into a stage, and every bystander was part of the play. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, news outlets had already picked up the story. Anchors spoke with tones of disbelief. An 11-year-old girl, traveling to honor her late mother, denied her rightful seat in first class. Images of Maya's small frame, clutching her leather portfolio, appeared on screens across the country. The locket glinting against her chest became an emblem, a symbol of dignity under fire. And the airline? Panic spread through its leadership like a virus. Corporate statements were drafted and redrafted in real time, trying to control a narrative that had already escaped their grip. Words like experience, operational necessity, and discretion were sprinkled in carefully, the language of bureaucracy masquerading as empathy. But the public wasn't buying it. Comment sections filled with fire. Stop hiding behind policy. Call it what it is. The ripple stretched further than anyone expected. Civil rights advocates, celebrities, and politicians shared Maya's story, demanding accountability. Editorials framed it as proof that racism doesn't just live in laws. It lives in lounges, in seating charts, in the subtle nods of authority that decide who belongs and who doesn't. And through it all, Maya stayed silent. She didn't post. She didn't pose. She didn't try to lead a movement. She was just a grieving child on her way to honor her mother. Yet her silence only amplified the noise. The less she spoke, the more the world filled in the blanks. She had become the voice for everyone who had been told to move aside, to wait their turn, to swallow injustice for the sake of comfort. The airline scrambled, announcing immediate policy reviews, cultural retraining, and disciplinary action for the staff involved. But the damage was done. The image of a young girl, standing with quiet dignity, had cut through polished PR statements. No slogan, no corporate apology could erase what millions had already seen with their own eyes. And perhaps the deepest irony was this: Maya never wanted to be a symbol. She only wanted to keep her mother's memory alive. Yet in defending her right to a single seat, she had forced a global company to face its rot. The ripple of justice had begun, and it was spreading far beyond the polished aisles of first class. Because this story was no longer about one child, one passenger, or one airline. It was about all the invisible moments when silence covers cruelty. And now, silence had been broken. The curtain on the conflict was closing, but something larger was stirring beyond the cabin walls. The world wasn't just watching anymore. The world was listening. The plane touched down in Boston under a sky that looked almost ceremonial. Heavy clouds splitting just enough for the morning sun to shine through. For most passengers, it was just another landing. But for Maya Nelson, it was an arrival drenched in meaning. She wasn't just stepping into another city. She was stepping into her mother's unfinished story. Clutching her worn leather portfolio, she moved through the terminal with a quiet strength. The silver locket bounced against her chest, catching the light with every step, as if reminding her that she wasn't walking alone. Hours earlier, she had been humiliated in front of strangers. Hours earlier, she had been told she didn't belong. But now, after an entire airline had bent under the weight of truth, she walked like a girl who carried a movement in her hands. The auditorium was packed. Rows of seats filled with scientists, activists, leaders, and ordinary people who had been touched by her mother's work. The air buzzed with anticipation, but it shifted when Maya appeared at the edge of the stage. The crowd wasn't looking at a grieving child anymore. They were staring at a symbol, someone who had carried herself with more dignity in 11 years than many adults managed in a lifetime. She took a breath, opened the portfolio, and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, but it wasn't weakness. It was raw truth breaking through. She spoke of her mother's brilliance, of the countless lives saved by her research, and of the love that still lived on in her absence. But she also spoke of something deeper: the pain of being silenced, the injustice of being treated as if she didn't belong, and the lesson her journey had carved into her soul. Dignity is not granted by seats, titles, or uniforms. Dignity is something you defend, even when the world tells you to sit down. The room was silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just the sound of her words landing like stones in a still pond. When she finished, the silence broke into thunder. Applause crashed through the hall, some rising to their feet, others wiping away tears. It wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." Later, as Maya stepped away from the podium, she caught her reflection in a glass wall. For a moment, she saw both of them, herself and her mother, walking side by side. And though grief still weighed on her, it no longer felt like a chain. It felt like fuel. Her locket carried a picture. Her voice carried a movement. But here's the question that lingers for us. If an 11-year-old girl can stand up to prejudice in the most intimidating spaces, what excuse do the rest of us have for staying silent? Because this wasn't just a story about a stolen seat. It was about stolen dignity, stolen opportunities, stolen voices. And if it can happen to Maya, it can happen to anyone. So I'll ask you directly, what would you do if your dignity was challenged in front of the world? Would you bow your head and let it pass? Or would you stand, even if your voice trembles? The fight for respect is not hers alone. It's ours. And if you believe stories like Maya's need to be heard, don't just watch in silence. Share this story. Comment your truth. Subscribe, because silence is the system's greatest ally. And together, we are here to break it.